Sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing love over profit. Sometimes the most powerful moment comes when someone sees your worth, when the whole world has written you off. In 9th century Norway, Freya and her frail mother stood in chains at the slave market. No one wanted them. The young woman was too defiant, the old woman too weak. But then Bjorn the Broken-Spear walked in. This feared Viking warrior shocked everyone by buying them both. He didn't take them to work his fields or serve in his hall. Instead, he gave them something no one expected. What made this legendary fighter choose mercy over money? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjords like the breath of sleeping gods, and in the timber hall of Borgheim the air hung thick with wood smoke and human misery. The slave market had drawn merchants from 3 kingdoms, their purses heavy with silver and their eyes sharp for profit. Chains clinked against wooden posts as dozens of captured souls stood in ragged lines, their faces bearing the hollow look of those who had learned not to hope. Among them stood Freya, her auburn hair matted, but her green eyes still blazing with a fire that captivity had not yet extinguished. At 22 winters, she possessed the kind of beauty that should have made her the most coveted prize in the hall, yet something in her bearing, the way she held her chin high, the defiant set of her shoulders warned potential buyers that this one would not break easily. Beside her, frail as a winter sparrow, stood her mother Signe. The older woman's once golden hair had turned silver, and her hands, gnarled by arthritis, could barely grip the rough hemp rope that bound her wrists. At 57, she was ancient by slave standards, her back bent from years of labor, and her breathing labored from the damp that had settled in her chest. They had been mother and daughter, farmer and weaver, in a small village called Thornwick, until the raiders came 3 moons ago. Freya still remembered the sound of splintering wood as axes bit through their door, the screams of neighbors, the smell of thatch catching fire. She had tried to hide her mother in the root cellar, but the raiders were thorough in their work. Now they stood as numbers in a ledger, reduced to flesh and bone, with price tags hanging around their necks like millstones. "Look at them," sneered a fat merchant from the eastern settlements, his breath reeking of fermented fish. "The old crow can barely stand, and the young one has murder in her eyes. Who wants a slave that plots while she works?" Other buyers nodded in agreement, their attention turning to the stronger specimens, young men with broad shoulders, women with gentle eyes and compliant demeanors. In this marketplace of human flesh, defiance was a luxury no one could afford to purchase. Freya felt her mother's trembling hand brush against hers, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by their captors. But in that touch, she found strength. They had survived the burning of their village, the forced march across hostile territory, and the degradation of the auction block. If death was to be their fate today, at least they would face it together. "Mother," she whispered, so quietly that only Signe could hear, "whatever happens, remember who we are. Remember Thornwick. Remember Father's stories by the fire." Signe's eyes, though clouded with pain, sparkled with something that might have been pride. "I remember, little flame. I remember everything." The great doors of the hall groaned open, letting in a shaft of pale sunlight that cut through the smoky gloom like a sword blade. The sound of conversation died away as every eye turned toward the entrance, for the figure that filled the doorway commanded attention without speaking a word. Bjorn Eriksson, called the Broken-Spear, stood 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe and arms that spoke of decades wielding sword and axe. His beard, once golden, had turned iron grey, and his face bore the map of countless battles, a scar across his left cheek, another that ran from his right temple to his jaw. His eyes, pale blue like winter ice, held the depth of a man who had seen too much death and carried too many ghosts. He was a legend, walking among mortals, a warrior whose name was spoken in hushed tones around hearth fires. Men said he had once held a mountain pass against 40 enemies, using nothing but his spear and his rage. They said he had sailed to the edge of the world and returned with treasures beyond counting. They said many things, but what every soul in that hall knew for certain was that Bjorn the Broken-Spear was a man who could take what he wanted and kill anyone who stood in his way. Yet there was something different about him now, something that made the slave merchants nervous. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of a man who had grown tired of being feared. His wealth was evident in the quality of his cloak, deep blue wool trimmed with silver thread, and the gold arm rings that marked him as a jarl of considerable holdings. But wealth and status meant little when backed by a reputation for violence that could silence a room full of hardened traders. Bjorn walked slowly through the rows of slaves, his boots making no sound on the straw-covered floor. He paused before a group of young men, warriors taken in some distant raid, their muscles still intact despite weeks of poor feeding. The lead merchant, a shrewd man called Halfdan the Thin, hurried to his side with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to selling human flesh. "Lord Bjorn," Halfdan said, his voice oily with deference, "these are prime specimens. Strong backs, good teeth, trained in the use of weapons. Any one of them would serve you well, as a house guard or field hand." Bjorn studied the men with eyes that missed nothing, then moved on without comment. He examined several young women, slaves taken from monasteries and farming settlements, each one chosen for youth and beauty that would translate to silver in the right buyer's purse. Still, he said nothing, his expression unreadable as carved stone. As he approached the section where Freya and Signy stood, the conversations around the hall grew quieter. These were the unwanted ones, the slaves that would likely be sold for meat to feed the pigs or simply put to death to avoid the expense of feeding them through winter. Halfdan followed reluctantly, clearly puzzled by the great warrior's interest in this particular corner of misery. "Lord Bjorn," the merchant said, his voice now uncertain, "these are marked for the cull. The old woman is past useful work, and the young one is spirited beyond taming. Perhaps I could interest you in—" "Be silent," Bjorn said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Halfdan's mouth snapped shut so quickly his teeth clicked. Bjorn stepped closer to where Freya and Signy stood, chained to the post, his ice-blue eyes moving from mother to daughter with an intensity that made both women's breath catch. Freya felt her defiance waver for a moment under that gaze, not from fear, but from something else, a strange sense that this man was seeing her, really seeing her, not as a commodity, but as a human being. When Bjorn spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been recognition. "What are your names?" The question caught everyone by surprise. Slaves were numbers, inventory, objects to be bought and sold. Their names mattered no more than the names of cattle or sheep. Freya lifted her chin and met his gaze directly, refusing to look away, despite every instinct telling her to show submission. "I am Freya, daughter of Eric the blacksmith. This is my mother, Signy the weaver. We are from Thornwick." "Freya," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "The lady of love and beauty. Your parents chose well." Signy spoke then, her voice cracked with age but steady with dignity. "My lord, my daughter has done nothing to earn your interest. If you seek to purchase her, I ask only that you remember she is a person of worth, not an animal for your use." The audacity of a slave making demands of a Viking lord sent ripples of shock through the watching crowd. Merchants and buyers alike held their breath, waiting for Bjorn's explosive reaction. Men had died for far less impertinence. Instead, something shifted in Bjorn's expression, a softening so subtle that only someone watching closely might have caught it. When he looked at Signy, it was with the careful attention one might give to a grandmother or a revered elder. "You speak bravely for one in chains," he said. "What was your husband's name?" "Eric Ironhand," Signy replied, straightening despite her bonds. He forged plows and horseshoes, but also blade and spearhead when needed. He fell defending our village. Bjorn nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something he had already suspected. He turned to Halfdan, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion and concern. What price for both of them? Halfdan blinked, certain he had misheard. My lord, I fear there may be some confusion. The old woman is marked for— I asked for a price, Bjorn interrupted, his voice carrying a hint of steel that made the merchant step backward. 20 silver pieces for the young woman, Halfdan said quickly, naming a price far below what such beauty would normally command, hoping to rid himself of problematic merchandise. As for the old woman, perhaps 5 pieces, though I must warn you that she may not survive the coming winter. Bjorn reached into his purse and withdrew a handful of coins that gleamed gold in the firelight. The sight of such wealth made every person in the hall catch their breath, for what he held was worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. I'll take them both, he said, placing the gold in Halfdan's trembling hands. Have them fed, cleaned, and brought to my ship within the hour. The merchant's eyes went wide as he realized the gold in his palm was enough to buy 10 prime slaves. My lord, surely this is too much. Keep it, Bjorn said, and see that they are treated gently. If I find they have been mistreated in any way, I will return, and we will discuss the matter with steel instead of silver. As Bjorn turned to leave, Freya found her voice. Why? She called after him, the word carrying all her confusion and desperate hope. Why us? Bjorn paused at the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning light. When he spoke, his words reached every corner of the silent hall. Because everyone deserves to be seen as more than the worst thing that has happened to them. Then he was gone, leaving behind a hall full of stunned faces and 2 women whose lives had just taken a turn towards something they had not dared to imagine hope. The longship times. Sea-wolf times cut through the grey waters of the fjord with the grace of its namesake, its dragon prow carving a path toward the distant mountains that marked Bjorn's territory. Freya sat in the stern with her mother, both women wrapped in thick wool cloaks that their unexpected benefactor had provided. The iron chains were gone, replaced by simple rope bonds that seemed more symbolic than restrictive, a reminder that their status remained uncertain. Bjorn stood at the bow, one massive hand resting on the carved dragon's head as he gazed toward home. His crew of 12 seasoned warriors worked the oars with practiced efficiency, their faces betraying no curiosity about their lord's unusual cargo. These men had sailed with Bjorn through storms and battles. They had learned not to question his decisions. Freya, Signy whispered, pulling her daughter closer as spray from the bow dampened their faces. What do you think he intends for us? Freya watched their mysterious savior, noting how he stood apart from his men, carrying himself with the lonely weight of command. I don't know, mother, but did you see his eyes when you spoke of father? There was recognition there, as if he knew something we don't. The older woman nodded slowly, her weathered hands clutching a small object she had kept hidden throughout their captivity. It was a bronze amulet, worn smooth by years of handling, bearing the hammer symbol of Thor. Eric had given it to her on their wedding day, and somehow she had managed to keep it concealed from their captors. As the ship rounded a bend in the fjord, Bjorn's holdings came into view, and both women gasped at the sight. Unlike the crude settlements they had passed, this was a place of prosperity and order. A great hall dominated the landscape, its roof supported by carved pillars and its walls adorned with shields that caught the afternoon sun. Surrounding it were workshops, storage buildings, and neat rows of houses where smoke rose from cooking fires. Fields of barley and rye stretched toward the tree line, and cattle grazed in stone-walled pastures. It's beautiful, Freya breathed, unable to hide her wonder. Bjorn turned at her words, and for the first time since the slave market, something approaching a smile crossed his features. My grandfather built the first hall here, and each generation has added to it. The land is good, rich soil, fresh water, and natural defenses. It has been home to my family for 8 generations. As the sea wolf times approached the dock, figures emerged from the settlement to greet their returning lord. Freya could see women in fine dresses, children running along the shore, and warriors whose bearing spoke of confidence and good treatment. This was no harsh military outpost, but a thriving community. A woman of perhaps 40 winters stood at the end of the pier, her silver-streaked hair braided with gold thread, and her dress the deep green of forest shadows. Her face bore the strong bones of nobility, but her expression was cold as winter stone as her eyes fixed on the 2 women beside Bjorn. "My lord husband," she called as the ship was secured to the dock, "you return with more than we expected." Bjorn stepped onto the pier and inclined his head respectfully. "Astrid, these are Freya and Signy, late of Thornwick. They will be our guests." The word guests sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled crowd. Slaves were common enough, but guests implied status, protection, and rights that few would dare to question. Astrid's lips pressed into a thin line. "Guests? My lord, surely you jest. They bear the marks of the slave market." "They bear the marks of suffering unjustly inflicted," Bjorn replied, his voice carrying a warning that his wife was approaching dangerous ground. "They will be treated with honor." Freya felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as she helped her mother from the ship. The looks ranged from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. It was clear that Bjorn's decision to bring them here was as much a surprise to his household as it had been to the slave merchants. A young man stepped forward from the crowd, his resemblance to Bjorn unmistakable despite his lighter coloring. This could only be Ragnar, the heir Freya had heard whispered about in the slave market, a warrior in his own right, but still untested in the crucible of true leadership. "Father," Ragnar said, his voice carefully controlled, "perhaps we should discuss your plans for our new guests in private." Bjorn studied his son with eyes that missed nothing. "Is there something about showing hospitality to those in need that requires discussion, my son?" The challenge in the question was unmistakable, and Ragnar's jaw tightened. Around them, the household watched this exchange with the keen attention of those who understood that currents of power and politics flowed beneath every interaction. "Of course not, father. I merely thought, good." Bjorn turned to address the crowd. "Freya and Signy are under my protection. They will be housed in the guest quarters and treated with the respect due to honored visitors. Anyone who questions this arrangement may bring their concerns to me directly." The crowd began to disperse, but not before Freya caught the meaningful glances exchanged between several of the household warriors. She had spent enough time in her father's smithy listening to the talk of fighting men to recognize the signs of brewing conflict. Astrid approached with the measured steps of a queen claiming her territory. "Come," she said to Freya and Signy, her voice coldly polite, "I will show you to your quarters." As they walked toward the great hall, Astrid spoke in low tones meant only for her charges. "I don't know what spell you have worked upon my husband, but understand this, I am mistress of this hall. Cross me, and you will find that my hospitality has limits." Signy straightened despite her exhaustion. "My lady, we seek no conflict. We are grateful for your husband's mercy and ask only for the chance to prove our worth." "Prove your worth?" Astrid's laugh held no warmth. "You are slaves pretending to be guests. Do not mistake my husband's temporary madness for permanent protection." The guest quarters proved to be a small but well-appointed building near the great hall, with a central fire pit, sleeping alcoves, and even a window that looked out over the fjord. It was finer than any dwelling Freya had ever known, yet she could not shake the feeling that it might also prove to be their prison. As Astrid departed with a final warning glance, Signy sank onto one of the sleeping furs with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Child, I fear we have escaped one form of captivity only to find ourselves in another." "Perhaps," Freya said, moving to the window where she could see Bjorn speaking intently with his son near the training grounds. But did you notice? He called father by name, Eric Ironhand. How could he know that? Signy's eyes sharpened. You think they knew each other? It would explain much. The way he looked at us, the recognition in his voice when you spoke father's name. Freya touched her mother's shoulder gently. What if this isn't charity, mother? What if this is honor debt? Before Signy could respond, a soft knock came at the door. A young woman entered bearing a tray of food and clean water for washing. She was perhaps 16, with kind eyes and the calloused hands of someone accustomed to work. I am Ingrid, she said, setting down her burden. Lord Bjorn sent me to see to your needs. He asks that you rest today and join the household for the evening meal. That's very kind, Freya said, noting how the girl's eyes darted nervously toward the door. Are you a servant here? A free woman, Ingrid replied with a hint of pride. My father serves Lord Bjorn as a carpenter. This is a good place for those who earn their keep honestly. After Ingrid left, Freya helped her mother wash and change into the clean clothes that had been provided. As Signy rested, Freya stood again at the window, watching the life of the settlement flow around her. Children played in the paths between buildings, women tended gardens and livestock, men worked at forges and looms. It was a vision of the life she and her mother had lost when Thornwick burned. We must be very careful, she murmured to herself, thinking of Astrid's cold hostility and Ragnar's barely concealed suspicion. One mistake, and we could lose this chance at a new beginning. But even as she spoke the words, Freya felt a spark of something she had thought dead hope. Whatever Bjorn's reasons for saving them, whatever debt or memory had moved him to act, they were alive and free. For the first time in months, tomorrow held the possibility of being better than today. Outside, the sun began to set over the fjord, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Soon, the evening meal would begin, and with it, the next chapter of their uncertain future. The great hall of Bjorn's settlement buzzed with conversation as the evening meal began, but Freya felt every eye upon her as she and her mother entered through the carved oak doors. Long tables filled with warriors, craftsmen, and their families created a maze of benches and bodies, all illuminated by the dancing flames of the central fire pit. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meat, fresh bread and ale, yet Freya's stomach churned with nervousness rather than hunger. Bjorn rose from the high table where he sat with his family and immediate retainers, his massive frame commanding instant attention. Freya, Signy, he called, his voice carrying easily over the din. Come, sit at my table as honored guests. A hush fell over the hall as mother and daughter made their way forward. Freya could feel the weight of judgment in every glance, the whispered questions that followed in their wake. At the high table, 2 places had been set between Bjorn and a grizzled warrior with iron-grey hair and knowing eyes. This is Gunnar Ironside, Bjorn said as he seated Signy with careful courtesy. My oldest friend and wisest counselor. Gunnar, these are the women I told you about. Gunnar studied them with interest rather than suspicion, his weathered face creasing into what might have been the beginning of a smile. Welcome to Ravenshollow, he said. It has been too long since we had new stories around our fire. Astrid sat stiffly beside her husband, her fingers wrapped around her drinking horn with white-knuckled intensity. She had changed into her finest dress, a creation of deep blue silk, with silver embroidery that proclaimed her status as Lady of the Hall. Yet beside Freya's natural beauty, even enhanced by exhaustion and rough treatment, the finery seemed like armor donned for battle. Tell us, Gunnar continued, as servants brought forth platters of meat and vessels of ale, what news from Thornwick? It has been many seasons since I heard word from that region. Signy's face darkened. There is no more Thornwick. Raiders came with the spring thaw and left nothing but ash and bones. Raiders? Ragnar leaned forward from his seat across the table, his interest sharp. Flying what banner? No banner, Freya replied, her voice steady despite the painful memories. They came like wolves in the night, killing for sport as much as plunder. My father and the other men tried to form a shield wall, but we were farmers and craftsmen, not warriors. Bjorn set down his drinking horn with deliberate care. Your father, Eric Ironhand, tell me of his death. The question sent a ripple of unease through the immediate area of the table. Even Astrid looked up from her studied indifference, sensing undercurrents she did not understand. Signy's voice broke slightly as she spoke. He held the village centre until the last. 3 raiders came at him together, but he stood over the body of young Olaf the baker's son until they cut him down. Even then, he took 2 of them with him. 3 against 1, and he killed 2. Bjorn mused, his pale eyes distant with memory. That sounds like the Eric I knew. You knew my father? Freya's voice rose above the general conversation, and nearby tables fell silent to listen. Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames that danced in the great fire pit. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old grief. Eric Ironhand saved my life 25 years ago during my first real battle. I was young, foolish, and separated from my shield brothers. 4 berserkers had me surrounded, and I was about to meet the All-Father when this giant of a man appeared from nowhere with a smith's hammer in his hands. The hall had grown completely silent now, every ear straining to hear the tale their lord was telling. He fought like Thor himself that day, Bjorn continued. Crushed skulls and shattered shields until the berserkers lay still. Then he looked at me, this young fool bleeding in the mud, and said, "Next time, boy, don't charge ahead of your friends." Gunnar chuckled. "Sound advice. I assume you thanked him properly?" "I tried to." Bjorn's expression grew troubled. "I offered him gold, land, a place in my warband. But Eric wanted none of it. Said he was done with war, that he had a woman waiting for him and a forge that needed tending. The only thing he would accept was my word that if he or his ever had need, I would answer." Understanding dawned on Freya's face. "An honor debt, the deepest kind," Bjorn confirmed. "Your father refused my gold but accepted my oath. I have carried that debt for 25 years, never knowing if I would have the chance to repay it." Astrid's drinking horn struck the table with enough force to make the nearby platters jump. "So this is charity born of old debts," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent hall. "How noble." The words were meant to sting, but Bjorn's response was measured and calm. "Honor is never charity, wife. It is the foundation upon which a man builds his reputation. And what of the foundation upon which a woman builds hers?" Astrid shot back. "Nost, nost, nost, nost do. Am I to welcome every stray you bring home because of some ancient obligation?" Ragnar shifted uncomfortably. "Mother, perhaps this is not the place." "No." Astrid rose from her seat, her face flushed with wine and anger. "This is exactly the place. Before the entire household, let it be known that I object to this folly. We know nothing of these women beyond their tales of woe. For all we know, they are spies sent by our enemies." Signy stood as well, her frail frame trembling with indignation. "My lady, you speak of things you do not understand. My husband died an honorable death, defending innocent people. My daughter and I have done nothing to earn your suspicion, except survive when others did not." "Survival can make people desperate," Astrid replied coldly. "Desperate enough to spin tales that play upon a good man's honor." The tension in the hall was thick enough to cut with a blade. Warriors reached instinctively for weapons that weren't there, while servants pressed against the walls to avoid being caught in the confrontation. Freya felt her mother's hand tremble on her arm and made a decision that would change everything. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her dress and withdrew the bronze amulet that Signy had kept hidden throughout their captivity. The hammer of Thor gleamed in the firelight, its surface worn smooth by decades of faithful handling. "This belonged to my father," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent hall. He wore it every day of his adult life. If Lord Bjorn truly knew him, he will recognize it. She walked around the table and placed the amulet before Bjorn, her heart pounding as she waited for his reaction. The massive warrior picked up the small bronze piece and examined it carefully, his expression unreadable. "The inscription," he said finally. "Thunder follows the brave. Eric told me once that his father had those words carved there after Eric's first successful forge blessing." Freya felt her knees go weak with relief. "Yes, grandfather said that Thor's hammer shapes both iron and courage." Bjorn closed his fingers around the amulet and looked directly at Astrid. "Does this satisfy your concerns about their truthfulness, wife?" Astrid's face had gone pale, but her chin remained stubbornly raised. "It proves they knew Eric Ironhand. It does not prove they deserve your protection." "Then I will prove that myself," Freya declared, her voice ringing with newfound determination. "Give me work, Lord Bjorn. Let me earn my place here through deed, not charity." The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Freya made her way to the settlement's forge, drawn by the familiar ring of hammer on anvil that had been the soundtrack of her childhood. The smithy was larger than her father's humble workshop, with 3 separate hearths and an array of tools that spoke of serious metalworking. At the main anvil stood a bear of a man, his massive arms covered in old burn scars, shaping what appeared to be a spear point with methodical precision. "You must be Magnus," Freya said, stepping into the smoky warmth of the forge. "I'm Freya. I was hoping you might have work for someone with smithing experience." The big man looked up, his weathered face creasing into lines of skepticism. "You? A woman who claims to know the forge?" He gestured to a half-completed horseshoe cooling on a side anvil. "Show me what you know about ironwork, girl. Finish that shoe." Freya studied the piece, noting the quality of the iron and the precision of the work already done. Without hesitation, she selected a hammer of appropriate weight, heated the shoe to the proper temperature, and began shaping the remaining portion. Her movements were sure and economical, each strike placed exactly where it needed to be. Magnus watched with growing interest as she worked, noting how she tested the heat by color alone and adjusted her technique based on the iron's response. When she quenched the finished shoe and held it up for inspection, his expression had changed from doubt to grudging respect. "Eric taught you well," he admitted. "I knew your father years ago. We traded knowledge of steel composition at the spring gathering in Jorvik. A good man and a better smith." "He was both," Freya agreed, setting aside the hammer. "I learned at his side from the time I could hold tongs without dropping them. If you'll have me, I can earn my keep here." Magnus nodded slowly. "I could use skilled help, especially with winter approaching. But you should know not everyone in this settlement will welcome a woman working the forge. Some of the men think it unnatural." "Let them think what they will," Freya replied. "I've spent my life proving that iron responds to skill, not gender." As if summoned by their conversation, Ragnar appeared in the doorway of the smithy, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. He was a handsome man in his late 20s, with his father's strong jaw and his mother's sharp intelligence, but there was something calculating in his pale blue eyes that made Freya wary. "Father sends word that you're to be given work if you desire it," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I see you've already made yourself at home." "I've asked Master Magnus for the chance to prove my worth," Freya replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Nothing more." Ragnar picked up the horseshoe she had completed, examining it with the eye of someone who understood quality metalwork. "Impressive. But smithing is dangerous work. Perhaps something more suited to your nature would be better weaving, perhaps, or working in the kitchens." The suggestion rankled, but Freya kept her voice level. "I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I assure you I'm quite capable of handling the dangers of the forge." "Are you?" Ragnar set down the horseshoe and stepped closer, his presence suddenly intimidating in the confined space. "Tell me, what do you know of the politics of this settlement? The delicate balance my father maintains with neighboring jarls?" The enemies who would love nothing more than to see weakness in our defences. Magnus shifted uncomfortably. Young lord, perhaps. I know that your father honoured a debt to mine, Freya interrupted, her temper beginning to rise despite her efforts to remain diplomatic. I know that we've done nothing to threaten anyone here except exist when some would prefer we didn't. Ragnar's smile was cold. Existence can be threat enough, depending on who you are and what you represent. You and your mother are living reminders of my father's softer impulses. Some might see that as weakness to be exploited. And you? Freya asked. What do you see? Before Ragnar could answer, a commotion arose from the direction of the great hall. Voices were raised in argument, and through the open door of the smithy they could see people gathering in the courtyard. Magnus wiped his hands on his leather apron and moved toward the disturbance. What's happening? Freya asked, following him outside. Trouble, Magnus muttered. That's Thorvald Redbeard's banner. A group of mounted warriors had arrived, their horses foam-flecked from hard riding. At their head rode a man whose name suited him well. His beard was indeed red as fresh blood, and his reputation was equally vivid. Thorvald was a rival jarl whose lands bordered Bjorn's to the west, and the two had been engaged in a careful dance of diplomacy and veiled threats for years. Bjorn emerged from the hall, flanked by Gunnar and several of his most trusted warriors. Even from a distance, Freya could see the tension in his bearing as he approached the mounted delegation. Thorvald, Bjorn called, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. What brings you to my hall without invitation or proper notice? Thorvald dismounted with deliberate arrogance, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. I come with news that concerns us both, Bjorn Eriksson. Word has reached me of strange happenings in your household. New faces, unexplained generosity, questions about your judgment. My household is my own concern, Bjorn replied, his tone dangerous. As is my judgment. Normally, I would agree, Thorvald said, his voice carrying to the growing crowd of onlookers. But when a man's judgment affects the stability of the region, when his actions invite questions about strength and wisdom, then it becomes a matter for all of us. Freya felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. Their presence had somehow become a political weapon being used against their protector. Speak plainly, Bjorn demanded. What accusations do you bring? Thorvald's smile was predatory. No accusations, old friend. Merely observations. You bring strangers into your hall, elevate slaves to guests, ignore the concerns of your own family. Some whisper that age has made you soft, that perhaps it's time for younger hands to guide the settlement's future. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ragnar's face had gone pale, and Freya could see other members of the household exchanging meaningful glances. This was more than just political posturing, it was a direct challenge to Bjorn's authority. I see, Bjorn said quietly, his voice carrying a note of deadly calm. And what would you have me do to address these concerns? Prove that you remain the man we once knew, Thorvald replied. Show that mercy has not made you weak, that your judgment remains sound. The old ways demand strength, Bjorn. The gods favor those who take what they need and hold what they have. Freya realized with growing horror that she and her mother had become the test by which Bjorn's fitness to lead would be measured. Their salvation had become his potential downfall, and the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. The great hall hummed with tension as Bjorn's council gathered to discuss Thorvald's challenge. Freya stood beside one of the carved pillars, officially present as a guest, but feeling more like evidence in a trial she didn't understand. Sinje sat nearby, her face pale with worry as she listened to the heated debates swirling around them. The man speaks truth, whether we like it or not, declared Olaf the Stout, one of Bjorn's older advisors. Your enemies are watching for any sign of weakness. Taking in slaves and calling them guests, it raises questions. Gunnar leaned forward in his chair, his scarred hands gripping the armrests. Since when do we bow to Thorvald's opinion of our honor? The man raids monasteries for silver and calls it glory, but he commands 40 warriors and has the ear of 3 other Jarls. Ragnar interjected, his voice cutting through the argument. We cannot ignore political reality because it offends our sense of justice. Astrid sat beside her husband, her expression carefully neutral, but Freya caught the satisfied gleam in her eyes as the council turned against Bjorn's decision. This was exactly the outcome she had hoped for, validation of her opposition wrapped in political necessity. Bjorn himself remained silent through much of the debate, his massive frame motionless as stone, while lesser men argued about his choices. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had made him a leader of men. "Tell me, Olaf," he said, fixing the older advisor with his pale stare. "When did we become so afraid of what other men think that we abandon our own principles?" "It's not fear, my lord," Olaf replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's wisdom. A leader must consider the greater good, even when it conflicts with personal desires." "Personal desires?" Bjorn's voice remained calm, but Freya could see the danger building behind his eyes. "Is honoring a debt to a man who saved my life now considered a personal indulgence?" Young Hakon, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, raised his voice from the back of the group. "Lord Bjorn, perhaps there's a middle path. What if the women were given positions that reflect their circumstances? House servants, perhaps, rather than guests?" The suggestion hung in the air like the smell of burning meat, and Freya felt her stomach clench with familiar shame. Back to being property, back to existing at the sufferance of others, back to having no voice in her own fate. "No," she said, stepping forward before she could lose her nerve. "I won't be hidden away like a shameful secret." Every eye in the hall turned to her, and she realized she had just committed a breach of protocol that could cost her everything. Women, especially foreign women of uncertain status, did not interrupt council meetings. But having spoken, she could only press forward. "Lord Bjorn," she continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "you spoke of proving that mercy has not made you weak. Give me the chance to prove that your mercy was not misplaced." Astrid's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "And how would you propose to do that? Challenge Thorvald to single combat?" "If necessary," Freya replied, earning gasps of astonishment from around the hall. Gunnar chuckled despite the tension. "I like her spirit, but Holmgang is for men with swords, not women with grievances." "Then let me earn the right to grievances," Freya shot back. "Give me a task that proves my worth to this settlement, something visible, something that even Thorvald Redbeard cannot dismiss as weakness." Bjorn studied her with the intensity of a hunting hawk examining its prey. "What did you have in mind?" Freya took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would change everything. The harvest festival is 3 weeks away. Every settlement in the region sends their finest crafts for display and trade. Let me forge something for your banner, a piece of metalwork that will demonstrate the quality of your household's artisans. Magnus, who had been silent until now, leaned forward with interest. "A bold proposal, but forgecraft is judged by masters of the art. One poor piece would reflect badly on all of us." "Then it won't be poor," Freya replied simply. "I learned from Eric Ironhand, who learned from his father before him. Give me good iron and proper tools, and I'll create something worthy of this hall." Ragnar shook his head. "Father, this is madness. You're asking the entire settlement to stake its reputation on the untested skills of a former slave. I'm asking for the chance to prove that your father's judgment was sound," Freya corrected. "That his mercy was strength, not weakness." "And if you fail," Astrid asked silkily, "if your creation brings shame instead of honor, what then becomes of my husband's reputation?" Freya met the woman's cold stare without flinching. "Then you'll have the satisfaction of being proven right, and I'll accept whatever fate Lord Bjorn deems appropriate." The silence that followed her words was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind through the rafters. Freya could feel the weight of decision pressing down on the room like a storm front, knowing that what happened next would determine not just her own future, but the delicate balance of power that kept the settlement stable. Finally, Bjorn rose from his chair, his movement causing every other person in the hall to tense with anticipation. He walked to where Freya stood, studying her face with eyes that seemed to see through to her very soul. "Very well," he said at last. "You have 3 weeks to create something worthy of our banner. Magnus will provide whatever materials you need, and you'll have access to the finest tools in our forge." Relief flooded through Freya, followed immediately by the crushing weight of responsibility. She had bought herself time and opportunity, but at the cost of making promises she could only hope to keep. "But understand this," Bjorn continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "If your work brings honor to this settlement, then you and your mother will have earned your place here through deed, not charity. If it brings shame—" He paused, letting the implication settle. "Then perhaps Thorvald's concerns about my judgment will prove justified." Astrid's smile was sharp with anticipated victory. "How generous of you, husband, to allow our reputation to rest in such capable hands." As the council began to disperse, Gunnar approached Freya with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You have courage, girl, I'll give you that. But courage without skill is just another word for foolishness." "Then I'd better make sure I have both," Freya replied, her mind already racing ahead to the work that lay before her. 3 weeks to forge not just metal, but her entire future, and possibly save the man who had saved her. The forge had become Freya's world, its rhythms as familiar as her own heartbeat, yet demanding in ways that pushed her skills to their absolute limits. For 2 weeks, she had worked from dawn until deep into the night, her hands blistered despite the calluses earned in her father's smithy, her back aching from the constant bending and lifting. The piece taking shape on her anvil was ambitious beyond anything she had ever attempted, a ceremonial war axe that would serve as both functional weapon and work of art. Magnus watched her work with growing respect, offering advice when asked, but largely leaving her to find her own solutions to the complex challenges she had set herself. The axe head was to be pattern-welded steel, with bands of different carbon content folded and twisted to create a design that resembled flowing water. The handle would be ash wood, wrapped in leather and silver wire, topped with a pommel cast in the shape of a raven's head. "The steel is singing true," Magnus observed, examining the latest section she had folded and welded. "Your father taught you the old ways well." Freya paused in her work to wipe sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of soot across her forehead. "He always said that iron has memory. Treat it with respect, and it remembers. Force it, and it becomes brittle with resentment." Wise words. Magnus picked up the wooden handle she had been carving in her spare moments, running his thumb along the intricate knotwork that spiraled down its length. "This is more than craftsmanship, girl. This is art." The compliment warmed her more than the forge fire, but Freya kept her expression focused. She had learned to ignore the whispers that followed her through the settlement, the barely concealed hostility of those who saw her presence as a threat to their comfortable order. What mattered was the work, the steady progress towards something that might redeem them all. A shadow fell across the forge entrance, and she looked up to see Ragnar silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He had taken to visiting the smithy every few days, ostensibly to check on her progress, but actually, she suspected, to look for signs of failure he could report to his mother. "How goes the great work?" he asked, stepping into the smoky warmth and examining the axe head where it lay cooling on the anvil. "Well enough," Freya replied guardedly. She had learned to be cautious around Bjorn's son, sensing currents of ambition and resentment that ran deeper than simple disapproval of her presence. Ragnar picked up the axe head, testing its weight and balance with the practiced hand of a warrior. "Impressive work," he admitted. Almost a shame it will likely be the last thing you forge here. What do you mean? Word has reached me from the northern settlements, Ragnar said, setting down the axe head with deliberate care. Strange tales of a woman smith who appeared from nowhere, claiming connection to the legendary Eric Ironhand. Some wonder if she might be more than she appears. Freya felt ice form in her stomach despite the heat of the forge. What kind of tales? Oh, nothing specific. Just whispers about spies and infiltrators, about enemies who might use sentiment and old debts to gain access to what they could never take by force. Ragnar's smile was coldly amused. You understand how these things spread a word here, a suggestion there, and soon even the most innocent explanation becomes suspect. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you, Ragnar replied, his voice dropping to a tone that spoke of deadly seriousness. My father's honor protects you for now, but honor is a fragile thing. If doubt begins to spread about your true purpose here, even his protection might not be enough. Magnus had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. Young lord, surely you don't believe these whispers. I've worked beside this woman for 2 weeks. She's no spy, she's Eric's daughter. As true as sunrise. I believe what I see, Ragnar said, and what I see is a woman whose arrival has created nothing but problems for this settlement. Thorvald Redbeard circles like a vulture. Our allies question my father's judgment, and our enemies grow bold, thinking we've grown soft. Then perhaps the problem isn't with my arrival, Freya said, her temper finally breaking through her caution. Perhaps the problem is with leaders who care more about what enemies think than what honor demands. The words hung in the air between them like the ring of steel on steel, and Freya immediately knew she had gone too far. Ragnar's face darkened with anger, and his hand dropped to the knife at his belt with instinctive menace. You forget yourself, slave, he snarled. Perhaps it's time someone reminded you of your place. That's enough. The voice that cut through the tension belonged to Gunnar, who stood in the doorway with the authority of age and experience. Ragnar, your father sent me to check on the progress of the work, not to witness you browbeating our guests. Ragnar straightened, his face flushing with embarrassment at being caught in such an display. Gunnar, I was merely— You were being a fool, the old warrior interrupted, and worse, you were being discourteous to a woman under your father's protection. What would Bjorn say if he knew you were using your position to intimidate those who cannot defend themselves? I can defend myself well enough, Freya said quietly, but Gunnar shook his head. Not against the heir to this settlement, you cannot. Not without bringing down consequences that would destroy everything Bjorn has worked to build. He fixed Ragnar with a stare that carried decades of hard-won respect. Go, cool your head, and remember that honor is not just about strength, it's about how we treat those who have no power to strike back. Ragnar left without another word, but the look he gave Freya promised that this confrontation was far from over. When he was gone, Gunnar examined the axe head with the eye of someone who had carried weapons into battle for 40 years. Fine work, he said finally. Your father would be proud. Will it be enough? Freya asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her through sleepless nights of worry. Gunnar was quiet for a long moment, his weathered fingers tracing the pattern-welded steel. That depends on more than just the quality of your smithing, girl. Politics and honor don't always walk the same path, and sometimes the best work in the world isn't enough to change minds that are already made up. The old warrior's words followed Freya through the rest of that day and into the night, where she lay awake, listening to her mother's labored breathing and wondering if her bold gamble might have doomed them both. Outside, the wind carried the sound of voices from the great hall, and she knew that men were gathering, talking, making decisions that would shape their fate. 1 week remained until the harvest festival, and with each passing hour, the weight of expectation grew heavier on her shoulders. The ceremonial war axe lay finished on the workbench, its pattern-welded blade gleaming with the serpentine designs that marked it as a masterwork. Freya had completed it with 2 days to spare before the harvest festival, but instead of satisfaction, she felt only a growing unease that had nothing to do with the quality of her work. Magnus circled the piece with reverent attention, his experienced eyes cataloguing every detail of the forging, the precise angles of the cutting edge, the flawless integration of the ash handle with its silver wire wrapping. "In 30 years of smithing," he said finally, "I have never seen finer work from hands so young. This would bring honor to any warrior's hall." "Then why do I feel like I've failed before I've even begun?" Freya asked, unable to shake the sensation that some crucial element was missing from her understanding. Before Magnus could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the forge entrance. Through the open door, they could see a small party of riders entering the settlement, not warriors this time, but traders and craftsmen arriving early for the festival. Among them rode a figure that made Freya's blood turn to ice in her veins. Knut the Crow sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever gold could buy passage. His black hair was streaked with premature grey, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed human lives as commodities to be bought and sold. He had been among the slave merchants at Borgheim, though he had shown no interest in purchasing the worthless pair that Bjorn had claimed. "Magnus," Freya said, her voice tight with sudden panic. "That man, I know him from the slave market." The big smith followed her gaze and frowned. "Knut Crow-Eye. He trades in information as much as goods. What would bring him here so close to the festival?" Freya felt the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place. The whispers Ragnar had mentioned, the growing suspicions about her identity, the convenient timing of doubts arising just as her test approached its conclusion, none of it was accidental. "I need to see my mother," she said, her mind racing through implications that grew more frightening with each passing moment. She found Signy in their quarters, sitting by the window with a piece of embroidery work that had become her contribution to preparing for the festival. The older woman looked up with a smile that faded immediately when she saw her daughter's expression. "What's wrong, little flame?" "Mother, what exactly did father tell you about his time as a warrior, before he settled down to smithing?" Signy set aside her needlework, her weathered hands folding carefully in her lap. "He spoke little of those days, said the past was buried and best left that way. Why do you ask?" "Think, mother, please. Anything he might have said about other warriors he knew, battles he fought, enemies he made." The older woman's face grew troubled as she searched her memory. "There was something once, when he had drunk too much ale at harvest time, he mentioned a name, a man he said he should have killed when he had the chance." Freya's heart began to pound. "What name? Knut something? Knut the betrayer? No, that wasn't it." Signy's eyes suddenly went wide with remembered fear. "Knut Crow-Eye? He called him Knut Crow-Eye, and said the man was a poison that turned honest warriors against each other for profit." The sound of voices from the courtyard drew them to the window, where they could see Bjorn greeting the newly arrived traders with the courtesy due to guests and business partners. Knut stood among them, his dark clothes and predatory stillness making him stand out like a raven among peacocks. "He's here for us," Freya said, the certainty settling in her stomach like lead. "Somehow he's learned about the harvest festival, about my challenge to prove our worth. He's come to make sure we fail." "But how could he know?" Signy asked. "We've told no one outside this settlement about your work." "He doesn't need to know the details," Freya replied, pieces of the puzzle continuing to fall into place. "He just needs to plant enough doubt to ensure that no matter how good my work is, people will question whether it's really mine." As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at their door. Ingrid entered with her usual courtesy, but her young face was tight with worry. "Freya," she said, "Lord Bjorn requests your presence in the great hall. There are questions that need answering." The walk to the hall felt like the longest journey of Freya's life. Inside, she found Bjorn seated in his high chair with Knut, standing before him like a serpent offering poisoned counsel. Astrid sat beside her husband, her face carefully neutral, but Freya caught the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. Ragnar stood with the other advisors, his expression unreadable. "Ah, Freya," Bjorn said as she approached. "Master Knut here brings interesting news from the southern settlements. It seems your reputation has travelled farther than we realized." Knut turned to study her with those pale, calculating eyes. Indeed, tales of the mysterious woman Smith who appeared from nowhere, claiming to be the daughter of the legendary Eric Ironhand. Quite remarkable, really, how quickly word of your talents has spread. "I claim nothing but the truth," Freya replied, though she could hear the defensive note in her own voice. "Of course," Knut said smoothly, "though truth can be such a flexible thing, can't it? For instance, I'm told you're preparing to display a masterwork at the Harvest Festival, a ceremonial axe of exceptional quality." "I am." "How interesting. You see, I knew Eric Ironhand quite well in our younger days. We served together in the war band of Jarl Thorsten the Bold. Eric was many things, brave, strong, honourable to a fault, but he was never a master smith. Competent, yes, but hardly capable of teaching the advanced techniques required for pattern-welded steel." The words hit the hall like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward in waves of shocked murmurs. Freya felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized how carefully this trap had been set. "Perhaps," Knut continued, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall, "the young woman learned her true skills elsewhere. Perhaps from masters whose names she dare not speak, whose purposes she dare not reveal." "You're suggesting she's a spy," Gunnar said, his voice flat with disbelief. "I'm suggesting that remarkable skills appearing from mysterious sources deserve scrutiny," Knut replied. "Especially when those skills are being used to gain influence over important men." Bjorn had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now he leaned forward in his chair, his pale eyes fixed on Knut with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, Knut Crow-Eye, what exactly did you know of Eric's smithing abilities? You speak as if you watched him work the forge." Something flickered in Knut's expression, surprise, perhaps, that his own knowledge was being questioned. "We campaigned together for 3 seasons. I saw his weapons, his repairs to equipment. Solid work, but nothing exceptional." "I see." Bjorn's voice carried a note that made several people in the hall shift nervously. "And did you know that Eric's grandfather was Olaf Ironbender, master smith to King Harald Fairhair himself?" Knut's confident expression faltered slightly. "I know. He never mentioned." "Strange," Bjorn continued, his voice growing softer and more dangerous, "because Eric spoke of his grandfather often and with great pride. He told me once that Olaf's techniques had been passed down through 3 generations, kept alive in small village forges long after the great workshops had forgotten them." The hall had gone completely silent now, every person present sensing that they were witnessing more than a simple dispute about smithing credentials. "But perhaps," Bjorn said, rising from his chair with deliberate menace, "you were too busy with other pursuits to notice such details. Too busy, perhaps, selling information about your shield brothers to their enemies." Knut's face went pale as he realized how thoroughly his carefully laid trap had been turned against him. "Lord Bjorn, I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Bjorn replied, his hand dropping to rest on his sword hilt. "I'm stating a fact. You are Knut the Betrayer, the oath-breaker who sold the location of Jarl Thorsten's camp to his enemies for a purse of silver. Eric recognized you 25 years ago and chose to let you live against his better judgment. I see now that his mercy was misplaced." The transformation in the hall was immediate and electric. Warriors reached for weapons, traders backed toward the doors, and Astrid's face went white with shock at this revelation. Freya felt her world tilt on its axis as she realized that her greatest challenge hadn't come from proving her skills or earning acceptance. It had come from an enemy her father had faced decades ago, and who had now followed them across the years to finish what he had started. The harvest festival dawned grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over the fjord like smoke from a funeral pyre. Despite the weather, delegations from 7 settlements had gathered in Bjorn's great hall, their banners flying from makeshift poles driven into the hard earth. The air buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the complex negotiations that marked such gatherings, alliances being forged, marriages arranged, and trade agreements hammered out over cups of ale and shared meals. Freya stood at the edge of the display area, watching craftsmen arrange their finest works on wooden tables draped with colourful cloth. Silver arm rings caught the torchlight beside intricately carved bone combs, while bolts of fine wool competed for attention with leather goods tooled in elaborate patterns. Her ceremonial axe lay on its own table, drawing admiring glances and whispered comments from those who passed. "Beautiful work," said an elderly man, whose calloused hands marked him as a master craftsman. "The pattern welding is exceptional. Those serpent designs flow like water. Who taught you the technique?" "My father," Freya replied, the answer coming automatically, despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The man nodded appreciatively. "Eric Ironhand's daughter, yes? I heard he had passed. A good man, and clearly a skilled teacher." As the morning progressed, similar conversations repeated themselves dozens of times. Masters of various crafts examined her work with professional interest, praising techniques and asking detailed questions about her methods. With each compliment, Freya felt a growing confidence that her gamble might actually succeed, until she noticed the small groups of men speaking in low voices near the hall's entrance. Knut the betrayer had not fled after his exposure the previous night. Instead, he had remained as Bjorn's guest, though heavily guarded and under constant watch. His presence had created an undercurrent of tension that ran through the festival like a poisoned stream, and Freya could see its effects in the careful way people avoided certain topics and the nervous glances cast toward Bjorn's high table. "The judging will begin soon," Magnus said, approaching with barely concealed worry. "The masters have finished examining all the entries, and they're gathering to make their decisions." Freya nodded, unable to trust her voice. Everything, her future, her mother's safety, Bjorn's reputation, hung in the balance of what would happen next. Thorvald Redbeard chose that moment to approach, his massive frame cutting through the crowd like a ship through waves. Behind him came 3 other Jarls, whose territories bordered Bjorn's lands, their faces bearing the serious expressions of men conducting important business. "So," Thorvald said, stopping before Freya's display table, "this is the work that has caused such discussion." He picked up the ceremonial axe with practiced hands, testing its balance and examining the pattern-welded blade with the eye of someone who had carried weapons into battle for decades. His inspection was thorough and professional, and when he set the axe down, his expression was carefully neutral. "Impressive craftsmanship," he admitted, "though I understand there are questions about its true authorship." "Questions raised by a known oath-breaker," Freya replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "A man who sold his shield brothers for silver and has spent 25 years perfecting the art of poisoning honest minds with doubt." Thorvald's eyebrows rose at her directness. "Bold words from one in your position, but then, boldness seems to run in your family. Your father was equally direct when he chose to save Bjorn's life all those years ago." "You knew my father." "I knew of him. The man who killed 2 berserkers with a smith's hammer while saving the life of a rival Jarl's son. Such deeds become legend quickly enough." Thorvald studied her face with new interest. "The question that troubles me is why Knut Crow-Eye would risk exposure by coming here to challenge your story. What does he gain by discrediting you?" The question struck Freya like a physical blow, revealing a dimension to the situation she hadn't considered. Knut's presence made no sense if his only goal was to sow doubt about her identity. The risk was too great, the potential reward too small. "I don't know," she admitted. "Perhaps," said a new voice, "that's because you're asking the wrong questions." They turned to see Gunnar approaching, his weathered face grim with some knowledge he clearly wished he didn't possess. Behind him came Bjorn himself, moving with the controlled tension of a predator preparing to strike. "What questions should we be asking?" Thorvald inquired. Gunnar looked directly at Freya as he spoke. "Not why Knut came here to challenge your story, but why he needed to ensure you would be here to challenge in the first place." The meaning of his words hit Freya like cold water. He knew we were coming. Before the slave market, before Bjorn bought us, he knew we would end up here. "More than that," Bjorn said, his voice carrying the deadly quiet that preceded violence. "He arranged it. 3 nights ago, under pressure, Knut admitted that he was the one who told the raiders where to find Thornwick. He sold your village for 20 pieces of silver, just as he once sold information about our military campaigns." The world seemed to tilt beneath Freya's feet as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Her father's death, her mother's suffering, their enslavement and degradation, all of it orchestrated by a man who traded in human misery for profit. "But why?" she whispered. "What could he possibly gain?" "Revenge," Gunnar said simply. "Your father spared his life 25 years ago, but also exposed his treachery to every warrior in the north. Knut has lived as an exile ever since, reduced to trading in scraps of information and minor deceits. He spent decades planning his vengeance against those who destroyed his reputation. And he thought to have it by destroying Eric's family," Bjorn added. "By ensuring that Eric's daughter would be enslaved and degraded, that his line would end in shame and suffering." Thorvald's expression had grown thunderous as the implications sank in. "You're telling me that this man orchestrated the destruction of an entire village for the sake of a personal grudge?" 43 dead, Bjorn confirmed. "Men, women, children all killed to satisfy one man's thirst for revenge against a ghost." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of footsteps as other Jarls and their retainers gathered to hear what was being discussed. Word of the revelation was spreading through the festival like fire through dry grass, and Freya could see the change in people's expressions as they learned the truth about Knut's crimes. "Where is he now?" Thorvald asked, his hand dropping to his sword hilt. "Secured in the storage building under guard," Bjorn replied. "I thought it best to let the festival proceed before dealing with him." "The festival?" Thorvald's laugh was harsh with anger. "There will be no celebrating while a child killer walks free, even in chains." Other voices rose in agreement as the crowd of onlookers grew larger. Freya found herself at the center of a storm of righteous fury that threatened to sweep away not just Knut, but any pretense of civilized discourse. "Wait," she called, her voice cutting through the growing tumult. "This isn't how it should be." The crowd turned toward her with expressions ranging from confusion to impatience. Here was a chance to see justice done in the old way, with steel and blood, and she was asking them to pause? "Knut deserves death," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her purpose. "But he also deserves to face the truth of what he's done, in front of everyone who might have believed his lies." "What are you proposing?" Bjorn asked. Freya looked around at the gathered crowd, Jarls and craftsmen, warriors and traders, all united in their anger at Knut's betrayal. "Let him face judgment here, in front of all the settlements he's tried to deceive. Let him answer for his crimes before he pays for them." Thorvald nodded slowly. "A public trial. Let everyone hear the evidence and witness the justice." "More than that," Freya said, the plan crystallizing in her mind even as she spoke. "Let him try one last time to justify his accusations against me. Let him explain how a village girl could master techniques her father supposedly never knew, how a slave could create work that rivals the finest smiths in the north." She gestured toward the ceremonial axe lying on its display table. "Let him stand here, in front of masters who know quality when they see it, and try to maintain his lies in the face of proof." Bjorn's expression shifted from anger to something that might have been admiration. "You want to let your work speak for itself." "I want to let the truth speak for itself," Freya corrected. "All of it. My father's heroism, Knut's betrayal, the quality of work that comes from honest teaching passed down through generations." The crowd was murmuring its approval of this approach when a commotion arose near the hall's entrance. Guards were approaching, escorting a man whose dark clothes and pale eyes marked him unmistakably as Knut the Betrayer. "It seems," Thorvald said with grim satisfaction, "that we won't have to wait long to hear what the Oathbreaker has to say for himself." As Knut was brought forward, Freya felt the weight of generations settling on her shoulders, her grandfather's techniques, her father's sacrifice, her mother's quiet strength. Whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but the meaning of all the choices that had brought them to this moment. The great hall had been transformed into a court of judgment, with Knut the Betrayer standing in the center of a circle formed by representatives from all 7 settlements. Torches blazed from every pillar, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with the tension filling the air. The ceremonial axe lay on a table before the accused, its pattern-welded steel gleaming like captured lightning. Knut stood with the defiant bearing of a man who had nothing left to lose, his pale eyes scanning the hostile faces surrounding him. Despite his bonds, despite the evidence of his crimes, he maintained the cold composure that had served him through decades of treachery. "Before we pronounce judgment," Bjorn announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed hall, "the accused will have the chance to defend himself against the charges brought before this assembly." Thorvald Redbeard stepped forward, his massive frame radiating barely contained violence. "Knut Crow-Eye, called the Betrayer, you stand accused of orchestrating the destruction of Thornwick village, resulting in 43 deaths, including that of Eric Ironhand. How do you answer?" Knut's laugh was like the cawing of his namesake bird. "I answer that you fools understand nothing of justice or necessity. Yes, I told the raiders where to find Thornwick. Yes, I knew Eric would die defending it. And yes, I planned for his daughter to suffer for his arrogance." Gasps of horror arose from the crowd at this casual admission of mass murder. Even hardened warriors, who had seen countless battles, looked shocked at the brazen callousness of his confession. "You admit to child-killing for the sake of personal revenge?" Gunnar demanded, his scarred face twisted with disgust. "I admit to teaching a lesson that should have been learned 25 years ago," Knut replied coldly. "Eric Ironhand humiliated me, destroyed my reputation, cost me everything I had built. Did you think such debts go unpaid forever?" Freya stepped forward, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "My father saved lives by exposing your treachery. How many men died because of the information you sold to our enemies?" "Fewer than died because of his righteousness," Knut shot back. "Eric could have kept silent, could have let bygones remain buried. Instead, he chose to destroy me for the sake of his precious honor." "He chose to prevent more deaths," Freya corrected. "He chose to protect innocent people from your betrayal." Knut's expression shifted, becoming almost pitying. "Innocent? Child, you know nothing of the world your father inhabited. We were all killers in those days, all of us stained with blood. The only difference was that some of us were honest about our nature. There's a difference between killing in battle and murdering children for silver," Magnus said, his deep voice rumbling with controlled fury. "Is there?" Knut challenged. "Tell me, how many villages has each man in this room burned? How many families have you destroyed in service to your lords? At least I was paid for my betrayals." The hall erupted in angry shouts, but Knut continued speaking over the noise. "You want to judge me for seeking revenge? Then judge yourselves for the countless acts of violence you call honorable, simply because they serve your purposes." Bjorn raised his hand for silence, and gradually the tumult died down. "You speak of revenge, but what of the lies you've spread here? The accusations against Freya's craftsmanship?" Knut's smile was razor-sharp. "Ah, yes, the miraculous smithwork. Tell me, child, how does it feel to know that your greatest achievement was born from my planning? I knew that Eric's daughter would eventually end up here, in this hall, seeking to prove her worth." "What are you talking about?" Freya demanded. "I arranged for specific information to reach Bjorn about the slave market, Knut replied with malicious satisfaction. I made sure he would know exactly when and where to find Eric's family. I even ensured that my fellow merchants would have no interest in purchasing you, leaving you available for his conscience-driven rescue. The revelation hit the hall like a thunderbolt. Even Bjorn's face showed shock at the realization that his act of honor had been manipulated by the very man he sought to oppose. You orchestrated our salvation? Signy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I orchestrated your testing, Knut corrected. I knew that Bjorn's guilt over his debt to Eric would compel him to save you, and I knew that his enemies would use that salvation against him. I counted on his need to prove his wisdom by giving you chances to redeem yourselves. Freya felt the world shifting beneath her feet as she understood the full scope of the manipulation. You wanted me to succeed. You wanted me to prove my skills. I wanted you to reveal them, Knut said. Because those skills are not your father's teaching, are they, child? They're far older, far more dangerous than simple village smithing. The hall fell silent as every eye turned toward Freya, waiting for her response to an accusation that seemed to cut deeper than anything that had come before. Freya stood in the center of the circle, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her as Knut's words echoed in the sudden silence. The implication hung in the air like smoke that her skills came from somewhere other than her father's teaching, somewhere darker and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. Speak, child, Thorvald commanded. What does the Oathbreaker mean by his accusations? Freya looked around the circle of faces, seeing suspicion beginning to creep back into expressions that had moments before been filled with righteous anger on her behalf. Even Bjorn's eyes held a question now, a flicker of uncertainty that cut her more deeply than any blade. I don't know what he means, she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Everything I know of smithcraft came from my father's teaching. Knut's laugh was triumphant. Did it, child? Then explain to these masters how a village blacksmith could teach pattern welding techniques that were lost with the fall of the great workshops. Explain how Eric Ironhand, who never traveled beyond his own valley after his war days, could pass down methods that only the court smiths of dead kings once knew. Magnus stepped forward, his weathered face troubled. Girl, I've worked iron for 30 years, and what you've done with that axe, the folding patterns, the way you've controlled the carbon content in each layer, these are techniques I've only heard described in the oldest songs. My grandfather taught my father, Freya insisted. Olaf Ironbender, who served King Harold Fairhair. Ah, yes, Knut said, circling her like a predator. The mysterious grandfather. Tell me, did anyone here ever meet this legendary Olaf Ironbender? Did anyone ever see him work his supposed miracles with steel? Silence answered him, and Freya felt her heart sink as she realized how little proof she had of her grandfather's existence beyond her father's stories. I thought not, Knut continued, because Olaf Ironbender is a myth, a story created to explain skills that have no earthly teacher. That's not true, Signy said, her voice cracking with age and emotion. I saw the tools he left Eric, the knowledge passed down. Tools can be stolen, knowledge can be bought, Knut interrupted. But the kind of mastery this girl displays, that comes from sources far older than human teaching. Gunnar's voice cut through the growing murmur of concern. What exactly are you accusing her of, betrayer? Knut's pale eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. I'm saying that this girl carries knowledge that was never meant for mortal hands. I'm saying that her skills come from the old ways, from powers that our ancestors were wise enough to fear. The accusation of sorcery sent a ripple of fear through the assembled crowd. In a world where the line between skill and magic was often thin, such charges could mean death, even for the innocent. Freya felt desperation rising in her throat, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. Enough. Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Astrid, who had remained silent throughout the trial, now stood with regal authority, her face set in lines of absolute determination. I have listened to enough lies for one lifetime, she declared, moving to stand beside Freya despite months of hostility between them. This man speaks of mysteries and dark powers to distract from the simple truth of his own evil. "My lady," Knut said, his voice smooth as oiled steel, "surely you of all people can see. I see a child killer trying to escape justice by weaving tales of sorcery," Astrid interrupted. "I see a coward who destroys innocent lives and then attempts to justify his crimes by questioning his victim's worth." She turned to address the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the authority of a woman born to rule. "You want proof of where this girl's skills came from? I'll give you proof." From beneath her cloak, Astrid withdrew an object wrapped in fine silk. She unfolded the cloth with reverent care, revealing an ancient hammer unlike anything Freya had ever seen. Its head was forged from steel, so pure it seemed to glow with inner light, and its handle was carved from wood so old it had turned nearly black with age. "This hammer belonged to my father's father," Astrid said, her voice heavy with generations of memory. "It was forged by Olaf Ironbender himself, payment for a debt of honor between our families. I have carried it for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal its existence." She held the hammer toward Freya, its ancient power seeming to fill the space between them. "If your skills truly come from Olaf's teaching, then this hammer will know its master's bloodline. Take it, child, and let us see what the ancestors have to say about your heritage." Freya reached out with trembling hands, her fingers closing around the handle of a tool that had been crafted by her grandfather's hands decades before her birth. The moment her skin touched the ancient wood, she felt something shift inside her, not magic, but memory. The echo of countless hours spent learning at her father's side, the weight of knowledge passed down through generations of honorable craftsmen. "Now," Astrid said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "show them what honest skill can accomplish." The ancient hammer felt alive in Freya's hands, its weight perfectly balanced despite its age, the steel head warm as if it had just left the forge. As her fingers traced the worn handle, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice echoing through the years, speaking the lessons her father had passed down through stories and patient instruction. "There's a piece of iron here," Magnus said, producing a small bar of raw metal from the festival supplies. "If the girl truly carries Olaf's knowledge, let her show us." Without hesitation, Freya moved to the portable forge that had been set up for demonstrations. The crowd followed, forming a circle around her as she began the ancient ritual of transforming base metal into something greater. She worked in silence, her movements sure and economical, heating the iron until it glowed cherry red in the dim light. With her first strike of Olaf's hammer, something extraordinary happened. The sound that rang out was not the simple clang of metal on metal, but something deeper, more musical, a note that seemed to resonate in the very bones of everyone present. The iron responded as if it were eager to be shaped, bending to her will with a fluidity that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge. "Impossible," breathed one of the visiting masters. "The metal moves like water under her hands." Strike by strike, fold by fold, Freya created a small blade that captured the essence of her grandfather's technique. The steel took on the serpentine patterns that marked true pattern welding, but more than that, it seemed to shimmer with an inner light that had nothing to do with the forge fire. Knut watched with growing alarm as his final gambit crumbled before his eyes. "Tricks," he snarled. "Showmanship designed to—" His words were cut off as Astrid stepped forward and took the newly forged blade from Freya's hands. Without warning, she drew her own dagger and struck the two pieces together. Instead of the clash of steel on steel, a pure, ringing tone emerged, the same note that had marked each hammer blow, but sustained and beautiful. "Only steel forged with Olaf's technique produces that sound," Astrid announced to the stunned crowd. It was his signature, his mark of mastery, that no counterfeiter has ever successfully replicated. Thorvald Redbeard stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching awe. "I withdraw any questions about this woman's heritage or abilities." What we have witnessed here proves beyond doubt that she carries the true knowledge of the Iron Bender lineage. Other voices rose in agreement, masters and jarls alike, acknowledging what their eyes and ears had confirmed. The tide of opinion that Knut had worked so carefully to turn against Freya now swept back toward her with overwhelming force. But the accusations remain, Gunnar pointed out, his weathered face grim with purpose. This man orchestrated the murder of 43 innocent people, his other crimes pale beside that butchery. Knut's composure finally cracked as he realized his position was hopeless. "You think your justice matters?" he spat. "You think killing me will undo what I've accomplished? I've spent 25 years planning this moment, and even now, even as you prepare to execute me, I've won." "How?" Bjorn asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Because I've shown you what your mercy costs," Knut replied, his voice rising with manic intensity. "Every moment you spent protecting these women, your enemies grew stronger. Every kindness you showed them, your reputation for ruthlessness diminished. I may die today, but I've proven that honor is weakness in a world that respects only strength." The hall fell silent as his words sank in, touching on fears that had haunted many of those present. In a harsh world where survival often depended on being feared, was mercy truly a luxury that leaders could not afford? It was Freya who broke the silence, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "You're wrong," she said simply. "My father showed mercy to you 25 years ago, and yes, it cost him his life. But it also saved Lord Bjorn, who went on to build this." She gestured toward the assembled crowd. "A settlement where craftsmen prosper, where families thrive, where strength serves to protect rather than merely to take." She walked to where Signy sat, helping her mother to her feet with gentle hands. "You see weakness in kindness because your heart is too small to understand that true strength lies in choosing to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than burn." Signy stepped forward, her frail frame somehow commanding attention despite her age. "My husband died defending his village, but his true legacy lives in the daughter he raised and the values he taught her. You may have taken our home, our safety, even our freedom for a time, but you could not touch the love that binds us together or the skills passed down through generations of honest work." Bjorn rose from his chair, his massive frame seeming to fill the hall as he pronounced judgment. "Knut Crow-Eye," called the betrayer, "you stand convicted of murder, oath-breaking, and the destruction of innocence for personal gain. The sentence is death, to be carried out at dawn. But first," Thorvald added, his voice carrying the weight of speaking for all the assembled jarls, "let it be known throughout the north that this man's crimes were exposed not by the strong preying upon the weak, but by the courage of those he sought to destroy." As guards led Knut away, Freya felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Astrid standing beside her, the older woman's face softer than she had ever seen it. "I owe you an apology," Astrid said quietly. "I let fear of change blind me to the worth of what you brought to our home. You and your mother have earned your place here through courage, skill, and dignity." "Thank you," Freya replied, meaning far more than just the apology. That evening, as the festival continued around them, Freya and Sinje stood together on the pier where their new life had begun months earlier. The ceremonial axe had been awarded the highest honors, but more importantly, they had found something Freya had thought lost forever: a place to belong, a future to build, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest strength lies in choosing love over fear, mercy over vengeance, and hope over despair. "What happens now, little flame?" Signy asked, using the pet name from Freya's childhood. Freya smiled, watching the sun set over the fjord that had become their home. "Now we live, mother. We work, we build, and we remember that even in the darkest times, there are still those who choose to light candles rather than curse the darkness." The iron chains that had once bound them were long since melted down and forged into something new, tools for building rather than symbols of captivity. And in the growing twilight, their future stretched before them, as bright as the sparks that flew from a master smith's hammer, full of possibility and promise.